No, I did not. And I'd say that I was involved initially with writing about XMRV, and that was about 6 years ago. And then I didn't really write much about it for a few years, on and off, the IOM report and some other things. But then I really started the PACE trial stuff started 2 years ago in October. So that was when I first published, but I've been researching it for a year. So that's been 3 years. And I didn't expect to be that long. I kind of thought it would be like other journalism projects. It's like I do my big thing and then I would move on. But there were other things interesting about it and other aspects to look at. And then also, I was just interested in it, and I could see that it was having an impact. And now I'm being paid to do it because I did my crowdfunding. So. I have to do it. So it's still very interesting to me, and I still feel like it's important, and useful to do. So, but no, I didn't expect it. I thought I'd move on to some other journalism project. I was kind of naive because I really thought that if you expose, and again, patients exposed it, but I exposed it in a different platform. So I thought if you expose in a scientific platform, although again it had been exposed in letters to the Lancet and so on, but I just thought if you make it really public and get attention that a study has these kinds of flaws, that it wouldn't survive 10 minutes. So I actually didn't think I'd be working on it this long, because it didn't occur to me that if you show that patients could be recovered or within normal range at baseline, and that analysis is in a study, that the study could survive. So I thought if you point out that people don't have informed consent per their protocol, that a study we don't have informed consent, we have to retract it. I was just very naive. I didn't really realize to what extent people can delude themselves, and that to what extent really fraudulent research can pass peer review apparently and be allowed to stand. That didn't occur. I just didn't think that. Anyway, they of course published their response, and of course we gave them the right to publish their response, and they kept writing about the misinformation in the articles, and I was a little nervous because I thought, what are they talking about? I knew it was all very accurate. And then they came up with the same nonsense that they've said in response to previous things, really stupid answers to the questions that the questions posed by my investigation and by patients for many years. Like, what does it mean that you can be within normal range or recovered at baseline? They don't have an answer for that. And if you don't have an answer for why some people are already recovered on your key variables when they entered your study, and your answer can't be, well, we have other recovery measures, so it didn't really matter. That's not a good answer. And they don't have good answers for any of the concerns. They have non-answers, as I've said often, and they continue to give non-answers. So they gave a whole series of non-answers, and I basically responded to the non-answers that they gave and showed that they were answers that were just ridiculous. And so after that, I never heard from them again, but I kept writing to them at different points saying, hi, I'm interested, I'm doing another post about this or that, and I'm, as a courtesy, I want to get your response, and, if I don't hear from you within 24 hours, I'll assume you have no comment per usual. And then I would send them afterwards. I would sometimes send them a blog post and say, hi, here's my latest blog post about your work. I'm sending it to you as a courtesy. You might have seen it already, but I'm sending it to you as a courtesy. So I've enjoyed doing that. I would still like to talk to them. I would still like to ask them what they could have been thinking, and I'd still like to understand why they did what they did and why they think it was okay from a scientific perspective. I've never gotten straight answers to those questions. They continually say we've responded to all the questions. As we've said, they write, as we've repeatedly said, and we responded here, here, here. Well, they haven't answered the questions. They've just given answers that are just non-responsive. So 3 months later, or whenever, we published the open letter with 42 signatures, and that day he wrote to Dr. Raccaniello and said, okay, send in a letter for publication with your complaints, your concerns, your serious concerns, and we'll get a response as well from the authors. And he didn't exactly say, promise 100% we'll publish it, but, basically he was asking for the same concerns to be outlined in a letter in a certain format for the journal that one can assume if you're writing that to 42 busy experts, international experts from the US and around the world, that you're going to actually publish their letter. Because why would you personally solicit a letter with 42 top people if you're not going to publish it? Well, the letter got written and sent, and they never published it, and they buried it, and we heard back from the there was just a form letter, and then when Dr. Racaniello wrote to the Lancet and said, "What the hell? This letter was solicited." The editorial office wrote back and said, "Well, we checked with the PACE authors, and they didn't see anything new there, so we're not publishing it." Essentially, is what they said. So the initial idea when I did this was that the studies, I really wanted the studies to be retracted. And I didn't recognize the difficulty in getting things retracted. So now I kind of slightly altered my goal. I mean, I think retraction is the appropriate response, scientific response, or at least major corrections, or major, updates with the revised findings, for example, based on the actual protocol methodology. So some form of action on the part of the journals. Given that that's clearly not happening, or that they're not, that will only happen if they are absolutely forced to do so, my goal really is to discredit the findings and to limit their impact on patients' treatment options. And so I think that's already happened to some degree with the CDC in the US, the Centers for Disease Control, having removed CBT and GET from their guidelines. Esther Crawley had a big press conference where she talked about the her FITNET NHS trial that was based on the Dutch FITNET trial. And so I wrote about, that I thought the FITNET trial and the Dutch FITNET trial was bogus. The findings were not serious, I didn't think. And that in basing her study on it, her study, was equally problematic, and problematic for other ways as well. First of all, let's just point out that there were no long-term benefits to the treatments because after 2 years, everybody was at the same level pretty much. So there were no long-term benefits. Recovery was a post hoc definition of recovery that they used for it. Basically, what was strange about it to me was that they compared FITNET, online delivered cognitive behavior therapy to what they called standard of care. So in the UK, in the Netherlands, they said standard of care was now providing CBT, GET, as mainly the standard of care. So as I understood it, the standard of care performed quite terribly in this trial, and this online CBT performed quite well if you judge by the subjective reports that they were given. Now let's also point out that this was an open label trial. Everybody knew what treatment they were getting, and it was a subjective, based on subjective findings. They did not include their objective findings, and in fact there were no objective findings that supported these findings. So basically what happened was that the standard of care that these same people have been promoting all these years, CBT and GET in person, performed very poorly in this study, FITNET. They also didn't address that. Why did those perform so poorly? To get up at professional conferences and to publicly accuse somebody of libel, which is a very serious charge, and what it says to me is that these people really have no understanding that criticism of their work is not the same thing as libel. They are so wedded to their false cognitions, if I can say, into their perceptions of their own reality, that they don't actually recognize that the science they're doing is flawed. She may not like it. I wrote to her university to complain about it. I also heard that she was, planning to get the Bristol University, her university, to send a cease and desist letter to me, demanding I stop. I'm not sure what. So I instead I never got it. I wrote a complaint to her university about her calling her, basically calling me libelous. And as far as I know, she hasn't repeated it. She'd be very stupid if she did. It's just not true. She can't, you can't just go around calling people libelous when you haven't pointed out anything inaccurate in their work. And the first letter, they responded, Dr. Recaniello also sent it to them directly. They responded and said, well, no, it's great that we never heard of the journal that this was published in. It's great that the, analysis got republished. Now readers can read both versions and decide for themselves which they prefer, and isn't that how science, is done? So basically they were saying, well, yes, we understand there's different interpretations and we're allowing that. And that sort of ridiculous was a really, really insulting response, because basically what we were pointing out wasn't that it was just a different interpretation, was that there were people in the study that they published who were already recovered on 2 of the 4 recovery baselines that the study had. And if you have people recovered, and this was 13%, already recovered on 1 or 2 of your recovery criteria at baseline, it's just ridiculous. It's incoherent. What does that mean? So you can't just say, well, we published this and you published that and it's all the same thing. No, you have to actually acknowledge that you made that mistake. I had a change at the university at Berkeley, where I've been for the last 8 years, also studying and getting my master's and my doctorate. So I guess I've been there for the last 13 years. And so my position was essentially, not defunded. Not my position, but there was no funding for my position. Academics, you can bring in your own money. So basically, I crowdfunded. So I'd been doing my half-time Berkeley job, and then I was doing this unpaid public health service job, which was writing about the PACE trial, and ME and CBT and GET. Do I think it caused a paradigm shift? No. I think it's an element of the paradigm shift. I think it's I think we're in a paradigm shift, definitely, in terms of this illness and the understanding. So we're definitely in a paradigm shift, which is why it's so hard to make, because basically the old guard is hanging on to their flawed and paradigm, which has been exposed as absurd, the cult of CBT and GET, and are clinging to it, even though all the evidence points the other way. So we are in a paradigm shift. Before the data was released, all the PACE trial authors could always say, well, there's been nothing in any peer-reviewed literature about this, or, no one's proven that. Well, now we have the data, and now there has been peer-reviewed literature, and now there's not only peer-reviewed literature, but there's quite a strong peer-reviewed commentary body of literature as well. So now it adds to the weight, and it adds to the momentum of the paradigm shift already going on. They've worked a lot with disability insurance companies, as we call them, or permanent insurance, I guess, in the UK, welfare benefits, and advised them that these treatments, CBT and GET, and other, I guess, rehabilitation strategies are effective ways of getting people back to work. They agreed to abide by the Declaration of Helsinki. That's one of many, many planks in the Declaration of Helsinki. Well, in their consent forms and in the information about the trial, they did not tell participants about their potential serious conflicts of interest, which involve their relationships with disability insurance companies, as well as their relationships with government agencies, but that's a separate issue. I call them on this, and from my perspective, none of their research findings should be published because they don't have legitimate informed consent per their own protocol. They can't answer the questions. I mean, basically, questions are being asked about their research that they really can't provide answers to because the answers they provide are inadequate. And so I think, I think they probably genuinely feel harassed. I don't think they are being harassed. I don't think their definitions of harassment really qualify as harassment, but I think that from their perspective, these things do qualify as harassment. And I think they do feel, also the terms that they're using is, they say there's a campaign against the PACE trial. Well, if you do a bad trial and you keep insisting against all evidence that the trial is good, then of course there's going to be a campaign against it. I mean, what would you expect? Patients are persistent, and they call it harassment. I have to acknowledge, I might, but I haven't watched it yet. So I haven't watched her TED Talk, and I haven't listened to or watched her open data talk, just bits and pieces. So that's one of the things I need to do. I am writing another post about her, so at some point I do need to watch her TED Talk. I'm assuming I did see in one of her talks she complained, or she mentioned now even the opponents have to resort to crowdfunding to mount their opposition. So I'm assuming that was a reference to me, where she didn't accuse me of libelous blogging, but she somehow thought that crowdfunding is not an appropriate technique with which to raise money to oppose her research, but I think it is. So it's interesting. I would love to know. I think, so what happened was NICE had a review, surveillance review of recent literature, and that was an internal review, and that review team came back and said, oh, let's leave the guidelines as they were in 2007, and those recommend CBT and GET, and were reaffirmed as valid after the PACE trial came out. The NICE allowed for a 2-week, or maybe they extended it, I think, to 3 or 4 weeks window period for registered stakeholders. And so basically a few of the professional associations said the guidelines should remain as is. And overwhelmingly, a whole number of patient organizations and advocates wrote that why the guidelines had to be redone. The idea that they're doing a full update could mean that they're just going to do a full update that's just a redo of the old ones. I don't think so. Why does the top people at NICE feel like they have to make a change? I think it's another sign of paradigm shift. I think it's just clear. I find the defense is shifting and the language getting softer, and they get a little more equivocal. Well, we never said this, or we never said that, or well, we do believe in physical things, and that kind of thing. So, Professor Crawley talks about, yes, well, of course we believe in physiology. Well, nobody said you don't believe in physiology, but I think they're trying to sound a little different, but I think they are very wedded to these positions, and it will be hard to pretend that they're not. The premise of it is false. The premise of it is that they're addressing a condition marked by deconditioning, in which people need to get back to their regular levels to get better. And now they seem to be saying, well, we didn't really mean that, or we never said that. It doesn't. There's no basis. There's no evidence that it does anything. They don't seem to be talking about recovery very much anymore, although FITNET, of course, does talk about full recovery, or at least recovery. And Esther Crawley talks about kids making a full recovery. So I don't see the point of offering it unless somebody has psychological distress. Well, so, the most useful thing, or a very useful thing, would be a biomarker. So, they keep talking about narrowing in on some sort of measure that would allow them to at least identify a subtype or some group of patients. We'll know soon whether the rituximab trial, it's a phase 3 trial in Norway of a drug that might have some effect. It's been very bizarre and interesting and rewarding, and I'm amazed at people's ability to delude themselves about such basic elements of science.